The envelope lay on the granite countertop, stark white against the dark, polished stone I had spent months selecting 3 years ago. It looked less like a gift and more like a summons. "Paris, Lorine," Jared announced, his arms spread wide as if he were presenting me with the world itself, or perhaps blocking my exit. "Just you and me, sweetheart, a second honeymoon. We leave at noon." I stood in the center of our kitchen, my favorite ceramic mug halfway to my lips, the steam curling into the morning light. The sun was streaming through the yellow curtains, casting a golden, hazy glow over the room where I had made breakfast every morning since 1990. Everything looked picturesque, normal. The smell of brewing coffee, the ticking of the wall clock, the man I had been married to for 34 years, standing there with that pleased, self-satisfied expression. It was the look of a man who had just solved a difficult puzzle, but the air felt different. It was heavy, pressurized, as if a storm were gathering inside the house despite the clear December sky outside. "Paris?" I repeated, setting the mug down. The ceramic clicked too loudly against the stone. "Jared, we can't just drop everything. I have my book club on Thursday, and the Hendersons' anniversary party is on Saturday. I promised Linda I'd help with the—" "Already taken care of," he interrupted, his smile not wavering, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I called Linda myself this morning. I told her you weren't feeling well, that you've been exhausted lately and needed some time away to recover." The words hit me like a splash of ice water. "You told them I wasn't feeling well?" "Jared, there is nothing wrong with me." He waved his hand dismissively, a gesture I had seen him use 1,000 times to brush away my concerns about finances, or the house, or his late nights. "Just a little white lie, sweetheart. Besides, you have been looking tired, a bit frazzled. A trip to Paris will do you good. I've already packed your bag. It's by the door." I looked toward the hallway. There it was, my black suitcase, standing like a sentry. He had packed for me while I was showering, another small surrender in a marriage full of them. I wanted to argue, to scream that I felt perfectly fine, that I didn't want to go, that his sudden spontaneity felt less like romance and more like a maneuver. But there was an edge to his voice that stopped me. It was a tone I had been hearing more often lately, impatient, condescending, the voice of a parent speaking to a slow-witted child. "The taxi will be here in 20 minutes, he said, checking his watch. It wasn't a suggestion. I moved through the next few minutes like a sleepwalker. I put on my coat, checked my reflection in the hallway mirror, and saw a woman who looked frightened, not excited. 34 years. We had built this life together, brick by brick, ever since his promotion at the insurance company made the mortgage payments possible. Every corner of this house held a memory. The living room where we hosted Christmas dinners, the den where I read while he watched football, the kitchen where I learned to make his mother's pot roast because mine was never salty enough. And yet, standing there, I felt like a stranger in my own home. When the taxi arrived, its yellow paint jarringly bright against the gray winter landscape, Jared was already ushering me out the door. "Come on, Lorine, we don't want to miss our flight." I stepped out into the biting December air. The wind stung my cheeks, waking me up slightly. That was when I saw Spencer. He was kneeling in the side garden, his weathered hands working the soil around the winter roses he had been tending for the past 15 years. Spencer was 72, a man of few words but immense observation. To most, he was just the hired help. To me, he had become a silent guardian. He noticed things. He noticed when the gutters were clogged, he noticed when the roses were thirsty, and he noticed when I was particularly quiet after one of Jared's sharp criticisms. Our eyes met across the frost-covered lawn. Usually, Spencer would offer a polite nod and return to his work. Today, he froze. He looked from me to the taxi, then back to me. There was something in his expression that I couldn't quite interpret: concern, warning, fear. The taxi driver was loading our bags into the trunk. Jared was busy checking his phone, his thumb scrolling rapidly, his body vibrating with a nervous energy that didn't match the celebratory mood of a vacation. Suddenly, Spencer stood up. He brushed the dirt from his knees and walked toward us. He moved with an urgency that was entirely out of character, his heavy work boots crunching loudly on the gravel driveway. "Mrs. Holloway," he called out. His voice carried a strange, intense note. "Spencer?" I replied, stopping halfway to the car. "Ma'am." He stopped a few feet away, ignoring Jared, who had looked up with a frown. Spencer's brown eyes were wide, surrounded by deep creases of worry. I saw his hands trembling at his sides. "Ma'am, please don't go." The words stopped the world. The wind seemed to die down. "Excuse me?" Jared snapped, stepping between us. "What is the problem here, Spencer?" "No problem, sir," Spencer said quickly, though his gaze never left mine. He looked desperate, his eyes pleading with me to understand a message he couldn't speak aloud. He lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. "Just trust me, Mrs. Holloway. Don't get in that car." I felt caught between two gravitational forces. My husband of 3 decades, who was commanding me to move, and this gentle man who had tended my garden with quiet dedication for 15 years. Jared was my life, my history. But Spencer had no reason to lie. The sheer terror in his eyes was real. "Lorine," Jared's voice cut through the air, sharp and angry. "We need to leave now." I looked at Spencer one last time. He gave me a microscopic nod, a plea. "Choose." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Instinct is a funny thing. You can ignore it for years, burying it under logic and duty and habit. But in that moment, staring at the open door of the taxi, my instinct screamed. It told me that the man holding the door wasn't taking me on a honeymoon. He was taking me away. I took a breath. "Actually," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. I turned back to Jared. "I forgot my reading glasses. You know I can't sleep on the plane without them." Jared's jaw tightened. I saw the flash of pure rage in his eyes before he masked it with a tight smile. "Lorine, we don't have time. Buy a pair at the airport." "It'll just take a second," I insisted, already backing away, moving toward the house. "You get settled. I'll be right back." I didn't wait for his permission. I turned and walked quickly toward the front door, feeling his eyes burning a hole in my back. Once inside, I didn't go to the bedroom. I didn't look for glasses. I moved through the kitchen and slipped out the back door, my movements silent and frantic. I ran across the frozen lawn to the guest house, a small, detached cottage we had built in 2012 for visiting family who rarely came. I let myself in, locking the door behind me with trembling fingers. The air inside was stale and cold, smelling of dust and disuse. I moved to the front window, keeping my body hidden behind the heavy drapes, and peered out through the crack. I had a perfect view of the driveway. I watched Jared. He was pacing by the taxi, checking his watch, then looking at the house. His honeymoon excitement had evaporated, replaced by a jagged, aggressive agitation. He looked like a man whose carefully constructed timeline was slipping. After 10 minutes, he stormed into the house. I could hear his muffled voice shouting my name, the sound carrying faintly across the yard. "Lorine! Lorine!" He came back out alone, furious. He spoke to the taxi driver, handed him a bill, and waved him away. The yellow car drove off, taking my suitcase with it. Jared stood in the driveway for a moment, running a hand through his thinning hair. Then, he pulled out his phone. He didn't look like a worried husband searching for a missing wife. He looked like a project manager dealing with a logistical failure. He made a call, his gestures sharp, chopping the air as he spoke. I sank onto the dusty armchair in the guest house, my knees finally giving out. "What are you doing, Lorine?" I asked myself. "You're hiding from your husband like a criminal." But the fear in my gut was cold and absolute. Spencer was right. I waited. The silence stretched out, agonizing and thick. An hour later, the sound of a heavy engine broke the quiet. I crept back to the window, expecting the taxi to have returned. It wasn't a taxi. A black van with heavily tinted windows pulled slowly into our driveway, parking in the exact spot where the taxi had been. It sat there, idling, looking like a sleek, dark predator that had found its prey. The side door slid open. 2 men stepped out. They were dressed in dark, nondescript clothing, moving with a casual confidence that terrified me. The first man was a stranger, tall, lean, with a face you would forget the moment you looked away. But the second man made the breath catch in my throat. It was Marcus, Jared's best friend since college. The man who had been the best man at our wedding. The man who had sat at our dinner table 100 times, drinking our wine and complaining about his ex-wife. Marcus, with his stocky build and carefully styled brown hair, was walking up my driveway. He wasn't smiling. He was carrying a large, hard-shell black case, the kind used for professional camera equipment or delicate electronics. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. Why was Marcus here? If I was supposed to be in Paris, why was Jared's best friend arriving at our empty house with a stranger and a van full of equipment? Jared met them at the front door. He didn't look surprised. He ushered them inside quickly, glancing up and down the street as if checking for witnesses. The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed in my bones. I sat in the darkening guest house, shivering in the unheated room. My husband wasn't planning a romantic getaway. He was planning an operation. And my absence hadn't stopped it. It had only forced them to improvise. The winter sun was beginning its early descent, casting long, bruised shadows across the lawn, when a soft knock on the guest house door made me nearly jump out of my skin. I had been sitting in the gloom for hours, watching the main house like a spy in enemy territory. "Mrs. Holloway?" It was a whisper. I cracked the door open. Spencer stood there, looking older and more fragile in the fading light, but his eyes burned with a grim determination I had never seen before. I pulled him inside, grateful for the solid presence of another human being, the only one, it seemed, who wasn't trying to destroy me. "Spencer, what is happening?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Who are those men? Why did you tell me not to go?" He ran a weathered hand through his gray hair. "Ma'am, I've been working around this house for 15 years. I'm invisible to most people. They forget the gardener has ears. Sound carries through open windows. What did you hear?" "Your husband. He's been making calls. Calls he doesn't want you to know about. He's been talking to doctors, to lawyers. I heard him using words like declining, early onset, and dangerous to herself." I sank back into the wicker chair, the room spinning. My mental state? That's absurd. Jared knows I'm fine. We've been married 34 years. He loves me. Spencer looked at me with a pity that hurt worse than the fear. "Ma'am, with all respect, love doesn't make a man lie to medical professionals. Love doesn't make a man research private psychiatric facilities that specialize in long-term isolation." I heard him mentioning a place called Millbrook Manor. It's 2 hours north. Very expensive, very discreet. "But why?" I whispered. "Why would he want to put me away?" "The money, Mrs. Holloway. The inheritance from your parents. $2 million. That's in a joint account," I said automatically. "Jared manages it." "Actually, ma'am, it isn't. Not yet." Spencer hesitated, then continued. "I saw the paperwork you dropped last month. The accounts are still in your name only. And Jared, he needs that money. I've seen the letters in the mailbox, the ones from the casinos, the ones marked final notice. His hands shake when he opens them. The pieces fell into place with a sickening click. The gambling debts, the pressure, the sudden second honeymoon designed to take me to a foreign country where I could conveniently have a breakdown. We waited until the black van drove away. 20 minutes later, Jared's silver sedan peeled out of the driveway. He was going to look for me, probably checking the airport or the train station. "Now," Spencer said, "we need to see what they did." Using Spencer's spare key, we entered the main house. It looked exactly as I had left it this morning, yet it felt violated. The air was stale. We moved silently, like intruders in our own home. It didn't take long to find their work. In the living room, tucked discreetly behind the silver frame of our wedding photo on the mantelpiece, was a lens no bigger than a button. I found another in the kitchen, positioned to capture the breakfast table. A third was in the bedroom, angled toward the bed. "They're building a case," Spencer said grimly, "documenting your behavior, creating evidence of confusion." In Jared's home office, we found the smoking gun. Hidden behind a false back in his filing cabinet were medical forms, already partially filled out in Jared's neat, careful handwriting. My eyes scanned the pages, horror rising in my throat like bile. Patient exhibits confusion, disorientation, episodes of aggressive paranoia, inability to recognize familiar faces. "All lies," I breathed, touching the paper. He's been writing a script for a play, and I'm the main character. And if he gets you committed, Spencer added, he gets power of attorney. He gets the money. You disappear into Millbrook Manor, and he plays the grieving husband. I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's betrayal. The man I had slept beside, cooked for, and loved for 3 decades was systematically planning to erase me. The fear that had been paralyzing me suddenly shifted. It hardened. It turned cold and sharp. Jared thought he was dealing with a confused, helpless old woman. He thought I was a sheep waiting for the slaughter. "How long until he comes back?" I asked, my voice steady for the first time all day. Spencer checked his watch. "Maybe an hour." "Good. We have work to do." "You're leaving?" Spencer asked. "No," I said, a plan forming in my mind, dangerous, terrifying, but necessary. "If I run, he reports me missing. He uses these forms to tell the police I've wandered off, that I'm mentally unstable. They'll hunt me down and hand me back to him. No, I have to stay." "Mrs. Holloway, that's suicide." "Not if I change the script." I looked at Spencer. "I'm going to tell him I got confused. I'm going to tell him I panicked at the airport and came home. I'm going to give him exactly what he wants, a wife who is losing her mind." "You're going to fake it?" "I'm going to act the role he wrote for me. If he thinks his plan is working, he'll get careless. He'll reveal more, and we will document everything." We scrambled back to the guest house just as Jared's car screeched into the driveway. I watched him storm into the house, shouting my name. I took a deep breath, smoothed my hair, and walked across the lawn to the back door. I found him in the bedroom, head in his hands. When he saw me, his relief was palpable, not because I was safe, I realize now, but because his asset had returned. "Lorine," he rushed to me, gripping my shoulders. "Where have you been? I was sick with worry." I looked at him, letting my eyes go slightly unfocused. I channeled every ounce of confusion and fear I could muster. "Jared, I don't know. We were at the airport, and then I couldn't remember why." He froze, his eyes sharpened, analyzing me. "You couldn't remember why we were there?" "I got so scared," I whimpered, pulling away from him. "All those people. I didn't know where I was. I took a taxi home, but I couldn't find my keys. I've been sitting in the garden. Jared, what's happening to me?" A slow, predatory satisfaction spread across his face, quickly masked by fake concern. He guided me to the bed, his voice dropping to that patronizing tone. "Oh, sweetheart, I think you're more tired than we realized. Maybe we should see a doctor. A specialist." "I'm scared," I said, and I wasn't acting. The next morning, the game truly began. Jared brought me my breakfast in bed, toast, orange juice, and a small paper cup with 2 pills. "Here you go, honey," he said, smiling warmly. "Just your daily vitamins. Help you get your strength back." I looked at the pills. They were different than the ones I usually took. "Thank you, Jared," I said meekly. I put the cup to my lips, feigning a swallow, but slipped the pills under my tongue. As soon as he turned to open the curtains, I spit them into a tissue and hid it in my sleeve. Later, I met Spencer by the rose bushes and handed him the damp tissue. "Find out what these are." 2 days later, Spencer came back with the results. "Sedatives mixed with cognitive suppressants," he told me, his face pale. "They cause memory fog, lethargy, and mild hallucinations. He's not just faking your illness, Mrs. Holloway. He's manufacturing it." I gripped the garden shears until my knuckles turned white. "He's poisoning me." "We have to go to the police," Spencer urged. "Not yet," I said, staring at the main house where Jared was watching TV, oblivious to the fact that his victim was waking up. It's his word against mine, and right now, he has months of fake documentation. I need undeniable proof. I need to catch him in the act. I looked at Spencer. "Tonight is Thursday. He goes to his poker game. I'm going to tear that office apart." The sound of Jared's car backing down the driveway was the starting gun. I stood by the window, hidden behind the curtains, watching until his taillights disappeared around the bend. It was Thursday night. Poker night. He wouldn't be back until past midnight. For 34 years, Thursday nights had been my quiet time, a few hours to read, take a long bath, or watch the shows he hated. Tonight, it was a countdown. I moved through the silent house, the familiar floorboards creaking under my feet like warning shots. I felt like a burglar in my own life. I went straight to his office. The door was closed, the air inside stale and smelling faintly of stale tobacco, a habit he swore he'd quit a decade ago. It was just another lie in a mountain of them. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I couldn't risk a neighbor seeing the glow at this hour. Instead, I clicked on the small pen light Spencer had given me earlier that afternoon. The thin beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the mahogany desk, the leather chair, the heavy filing cabinet in the corner. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that made my hands shake. "Pull it together, Lorine," I told myself. "If you don't find this proof, you lose your life." I went to the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. It was locked, of course, but Spencer had been thorough. He'd shown me a simple trick with a tension wrench and a paperclip, a skill he'd picked up in a life far harder than mine. It took me 3 tries, sweat pricking at my hairline despite the chill in the room. On the 3rd try, the lock turned with a soft, satisfying click. I slid the drawer open. It was organized with military precision. Jared was a meticulous man. It was one of the things I used to admire about him. Now, that trait terrified me. I flipped past the tax returns and the house deed until I found a thick manila folder tucked in the very back. It didn't have a label. I opened it, and the beam of my flashlight illuminated a nightmare. The first document was a dossier on my mental health. It dated back 6 months. I flipped through pages of notes written in Jared's distinct, angular handwriting. There were dates and times of incidents that never happened. August 14th, Lorine became aggressive during dinner, threw a plate, claimed I was an imposter. September 3rd, found Lorine wandering the backyard at 2 a.m., confusing the rose bushes for her deceased mother. October 12th, violent outburst. Threatened Marcus with a kitchen knife. I stared at the page, my mouth dry. Marcus. He wasn't just a silent accomplice. He was a witness. He was corroborating these lies. They were building a history of violence to justify locking me away. I dug deeper. Beneath the medical logs was a document titled simply, Project Timeline. I felt sick as I read the bullet points. Phase 1. Establish pattern of cognitive decline. Documentation and witness testimony. Status, complete. Phase 2. Introduce chemical cognitive suppressants to induce symptoms. Status, active. Phase 3. Medical evaluation confirming diagnosis. Status, scheduled Dex 15th. Phase 4. Emergency commitment following staged violent episode. Status, prepared. Phase 5. Transfer to long-term care facility. Liquidate assets. Status, pending. Phase 2. Chemical cognitive suppressants, the vitamins. Seeing it written down in black and white stripped away the last shred of denial I might have been clinging to. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't just greed. It was a calculated, step-by-step dismantling of a human being. Beneath the timeline was a glossy brochure for Millbrook Manor. The front cover showed a serene garden with high walls. I opened it. It was marketed as a premier facility for difficult cases. The text boasted about complete discretion and restricted access for patient safety. It was a prison for unwanted wives. A place where you checked in, but never checked out. Clipped to the brochure was a contract. Jared had already signed it. He had paid a deposit of $50,000 from an account I didn't know existed. But the final document in the folder was the one that broke me. It was a single sheet of paper, a draft. At the top, in bold letters, it read, Obituary. Lorine Margaret Holloway, 64, passed away peacefully on date TBD after a courageous, private battle with early-onset dementia. She is survived by her devoted husband, Jared, who cared for her until the very end. I sat back in his leather chair, the breath knocked out of me. The room seemed to tilt. He had already written my death notice. He was already imagining the sympathy cards, the funeral, the devoted husband playing the role of the grieving widower while he spent my parents' money. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. The tears evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard rage that settled in my gut like a stone. The woman who had loved Jared Holloway for 34 years died in that chair. In her place sat someone else, someone dangerous. I took the small digital camera Spencer had given me and began to photograph. I photographed every page, every lie, every signature. I photographed the timeline, the fake medical logs, the brochure, the obituary. My hands were steady now. I was no longer a victim. I was an investigator building a case. When I was done, I put everything back exactly as I found it. I locked the drawer. I wiped the handle with the hem of my robe to remove my fingerprints. I went back upstairs and climbed into bed. I lay there in the dark, listening to the silence of the house that had become a trap. When Jared came home 2 hours later, smelling of smoke and cheap cologne, I didn't move. I listened to him brush his teeth. I felt the mattress dip as he climbed in beside me. I felt his arm drape over my waist, a gesture that used to make me feel safe, but now felt like the coil of a snake. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered. "Good night," I murmured, my voice thick with sleep. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, planning his destruction. The next morning, the air in the kitchen was brittle. It was the day of the appointment. Jared was vibrating with nervous energy, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of concern. "Eat up, Lorine," he said, pushing a plate of eggs toward me. "We have that appointment with Dr. Harrison at 2 o'clock. You remember, right?" "Dr. Harrison," I repeated, letting my fork hover uncertainly over the food. I gave him a vacant, confused look. Is he the one for my eyes?" Jared sighed, a sound of practiced patience. "No, honey. He's the memory specialist. We talked about this." "Right, the memory specialist." I took a bite of the eggs. They tasted like ash. I had spent the morning preparing. I had the recorder taped to the inside of my purse. I had the baggie of pills Spencer had analyzed hidden in my pocket. I had the copies of the documents from his office folded into a tight square in my bra. I looked at my husband across the table. He was checking his watch again. He was thinking about Phase 3. He was thinking about the staged, violent episode he probably planned to trigger later today to justify the commitment. He had no idea that Phase 3 had been cancelled. "Jared," I said softly. He looked up. "Yes? Do you love me?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a split second, the mask slipped, and I saw the annoyance, the boredom, the contempt. Then, the smile returned. "Of course I love you, Lorine. That's why I'm doing all of this, to get you the help you need." "I know," I said, and I smiled back. A genuine smile. "I know exactly what you're doing." He didn't catch the double meaning. He was too arrogant, too sure of his victory. The drive to Dr. Harrison's office was silent. I stared out the window at the passing city, saying goodbye to the life I used to have. The suburbs, the shopping malls, the routine. Whatever happened in that office today, I wasn't coming back to this life. Dr. Harrison's office was in a sleek, modern medical building. The waiting room was plush, designed to whisper money and discretion. "Mr. and Mrs. Holloway?" the receptionist called. Jared stood up and offered me his hand. "Come on, Lorine, it's time." I looked at his hand, the hand that had placed a ring on my finger, the hand that had signed my commitment papers, the hand that had written my obituary. I took it. His skin was warm. Mine was ice cold. "Yes," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt. "It's time." We walked through the double doors and into the trap. But Jared didn't know who the trap was really for. Dr. Harrison's office was a theater of intimidation. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick medical texts that looked like they had never been opened. Behind the massive desk sat the man who held my future in his pen, Dr. Harrison was younger than I expected, with slicked back hair and the hungry eyes of a man who had sold his ethics for a down payment on a yacht. Jared sat close to me, his body angled to project the image of the protective, suffering husband. He squeezed my hand. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just answer the doctor's questions." Dr. Harrison peered at me over his glasses. "Mrs. Holloway, your husband tells me you've been experiencing some difficulties lately." "Difficulties?" I echoed, letting my voice waver. I looked around the room, blinking rapidly. I don't know. Sometimes the room feels wrong." Jared nodded solemnly at the doctor. She gets like this. Confused, disoriented. Last night she didn't even recognize our own kitchen. I see, Harrison said, scribbling on a notepad. Mrs. Holloway, do you know what year it is? This was the test. If I answered correctly, they would claim it was a moment of clarity. If I failed, it was proof of decline. I decided to give them exactly what they wanted until I didn't. Is it 1,999? I asked, looking at Jared for confirmation. Jared let out a tragic sigh. See? It's getting worse, doctor. And the aggression. Tell him about the aggression, Lorine. Aggression? I frowned. The knife, Lorine, Jared prompted, his voice tight. When you threatened me. Doctor? Harrison leaned forward. Violence is a serious escalation, Mrs. Holloway. Given the rapid decline your husband has documented, I'm very concerned. We need to discuss immediate intervention. Intervention? I asked, shrinking back into my chair. Residential care. Harrison said smoothly. There is a facility, Millbrook Manor. They specialize in cases like yours. I've already spoken with the director. They have a bed available today. Today? I whispered. It's for the best, Jared said, turning to me, his eyes pleading, but his grip on my arm painful. Lorine, I can't protect you anymore. You're a danger to yourself. Please. Sign the papers. Let us help you. Dr. Harrison pushed a document across the desk. The commitment order. The room went silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the thumping of my own heart. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at Jared. I saw the triumph behind his sad mask. He thought he had won. He thought I was broken. I sat up straight. I pulled my hand from Jared's grip and smoothed my skirt. The confusion vanished from my face, replaced by a clarity as sharp as a diamond. No, I said. My voice was clear, strong, and completely devoid of fear. Jared blinked. Lorine? What are you? I said no, Jared. I won't be signing that, and I certainly won't be going to Millbrook Manor. I reached into my purse. The air in the room changed instantly. Dr. Harrison stopped writing. Jared stiffened. Doctor, I said, turning my gaze to the physician. I'm curious. What is the going rate for a false diagnosis these days? Is it a flat fee, or do you get a percentage of the inheritance? Excuse me? Harrison sputtered, his face flushing red. Mrs. Holloway, your paranoia is showing. It's not paranoia if they're really out to get you. I cut him off. I pulled out the small plastic bag containing the pills. I slammed it onto the mahogany desk. These are the vitamins my husband has been feeding me. I had them analyzed. Sedatives and cognitive suppressants. Enough to make a sane woman look like she's losing her mind. Jared stood up, knocking his chair back. Lorine, give me that. You're delusional. Sit down, Jared, I commanded. The authority in my voice froze him. I'm not finished. I reached into my purse again and pulled out the recorder. I held it up. The red light was steady. I have recorded every word of this consultation. Your coercion, your leading questions, your prearranged agreement with a facility I've never seen. Then, the final blow. I pulled out the folded papers from my bra, the copies of the timeline, the fake medical logs, the obituary. I fanned them out on the desk like a winning poker hand. And this, I said, pointing to the timeline. Phase 4, emergency commitment. You're right on schedule, Jared. But you forgot one thing. You underestimated the woman you married. You broke into my office, Jared stammered, his face draining of color. He looked at Dr. Harrison, panic rising. She's crazy. She forged these. Did I forge the life insurance policy too? I asked coldly. The one for $1 million? Or the obituary where you describe my peaceful passing? Dr. Harrison was standing now, backing away from the desk, his hands raised. I didn't know about any of this. I was just following clinical. Save it for the police, I said. The police? Jared laughed nervously. Lorine, stop this drama. Let's go home. I am going home, I said. You're not. I turned toward the door. Spencer. The door swung open. Spencer stepped in, looking taller than I had ever seen him. Behind him were 2 uniformed officers. Mrs. Holloway? One officer asked. Yes, I said, pointing at the two men. "That is my husband, Jared Holloway, and that is Dr. Saul Harrison. I have evidence that they are conspiring to commit fraud, unlawful imprisonment, and attempted murder." The color left Jared's face completely. He looked from the police to me, and for the first time in 34 years, I saw him for what he really was: a small, greedy, frightened man. "Lorine," he choked out. "Baby, please. It was just, we can talk about this." "We're done talking," I said. I watched as they cuffed him. I watched as they read him his rights. As they led him past me, he tried to catch my eye, searching for the submissive wife who had always forgiven him. She wasn't there. 6 months later, the spring air was sweet and clean. I sat on the patio of my new cottage, watching Spencer kneel by the flower bed. He was planting roses, my favorite kind, the deep red ones that survived the winter. This house was smaller. It didn't have granite countertops or a guest house, but it was mine. Every inch of it was paid for, and every inch of it was honest. The trial had been swift. The evidence I gathered, the photos, the recordings, the pills, was damning. Jared was sentenced to 8 years. Dr. Harrison lost his license and got 5. Marcus turned state's witness and gave up the whole ring. It turned out I wasn't the first wife they had targeted, but I was the first one who fought back. The settlement from the lawsuit against the insurance company and the medical board was substantial. I used part of it to start a foundation for elderly victims of financial abuse. I spent my days helping women who were where I had been scared, confused, and gaslighted by the people they loved. "Mrs. Holloway?" Spencer called out, wiping his hands on a rag. "Where do you want these hydrangeas?" I sipped my tea, real tea, with nothing added but a little honey. "I told you, Spencer, call me Lorine, and put them wherever you think they look best. It's our garden." He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. Spencer wasn't just my gardener anymore. He was my estate manager, my partner in the foundation, and my best friend. We weren't lovers, that part of my life was done, but we were something perhaps more durable. We were survivors who had saved each other. I looked out at the horizon. I was 65 years old. I was single. I carried the scars of a betrayal so deep it should have killed me. But as the sun warmed my face, I realized something. Jared had tried to erase me. He had tried to write the end of my story, but he had failed. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of fresh earth and freedom. The story wasn't over. In fact, for the first time in my life, it was just beginning.